All right, I've given some spicy takes. I'm gonna give another one here, and you can just tell me what you think. I think Pine Barrens is overrated. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Serialized. I'm your host, Kino. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about Sopranos Season 3. For some reason, you haven't heard the previous two episodes, definitely check those out. But I'm continuing my breakdown of the show with Stephanie from Soprano Blueprints. How you doing today, Stephanie?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, this has been it's been fun recording these.
Yeah, definitely. It's like going down memory lane, as Tony would say.
Remember when is the lowest form of conversation, though, so maybe that's not a good sign for the podcast. But
it is. But I think Tony he did remember when once in a while when it was something that reflected well on him.
Yeah, he liked to remember when it was about himself, But yeah, jumping into season 3 here. I know, just right off the bat, I know that a lot of people say that, the later seasons of The Sopranos are so dark and stuff like that. But I think if you actually kind of look at it, I think season 3...
Mid-season 3, the mid-season 3, I actually did a video recently about it. It's sort of like the mid-season 3 trifecta of violence, sort of. I don't know if that's what you were going to get, but in terms of not only those episodes, but in terms of Employee of the Month, another Toothpick, and University, sort of bam, 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 one after the other.
Yeah, I think season 3 is definitely the darkest season of the show for me in terms of the subject matter it deals with. And we'll obviously be talking about those episodes. But yeah, it is funny that again, I know the later seasons are very dark as well, but I think in particular, this is some of the most brutal subject matter the show has ever dealt with.
Well, I think also later on in the show, the world also has become a darker place, whereas this is the final season before 9/11. So we're still sort of living in this sort of more innocent world. So comparatively speaking, to your point, it was very, very dark.
Yeah, it's interesting that, the direction the show takes starting this season, because this show takes a different turn than it was originally going to go, which we'll talk about in an episode here. But it starts off interesting. This is Mr. Ruggerio's Neighborhood is one of probably the strangest episode they've done so far, in the sense that it opens from not Tony's perspective or the mob's perspective, it opens from the FBI's perspective.
Yeah, and it's interesting how they start out, because if you're watching for the first time, you're like, oh, are they going to have sort of the more from the FBI's perspective this season, sort of similar to how other shows sort of have a different focus on a different point of view per season. So it was interesting just sort of seeing it from their point of view, whereas we'd only sort of seen them in little bits and pieces prior to that, or with their rap, with Skip and Puss.
Yeah, we're definitely seeing what they had to go through for the investigation. We've only seen it from Tony's end so far, but we're seeing that it's actually a lot of trouble to investigate these guys, and it's a difficult process they have to all kind of be working together towards. I also think it's interesting that so part of this episode deals with Patsy Parisi, who we were introduced to his twin brother last season, Philly Spoons Parisi. The backstory was that they liked the actor Dan Grimaldi, and they kind of regretted killing him off, so they brought him back as his twin brother. And we actually saw him at the end of last season.
Right, in the end Funhouse, when he said, "Oh, I'm Philly."
But then we're finally getting kind of a real explanation of who the character is in this episode. And even though he's mostly a background player for most of the show, he actually is going to become very important in later seasons.
Yes, I think he's pretty, overall, pretty underrated character almost in that sense, in terms of, some people, they kind of just, brush over the first couple layers of the show. It's easy to sort of just see him as this kind of guy in the background, but he definitely comes to the foreground the later we go, like you mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. And moving on to the next episode, Proshai Livushka, I just want to get into that because this is one of the most important episodes in that it changes the direction that the show takes. Nancy Marchand unfortunately passed away before season 3 got started, and so they had to write her death into the show. And originally, as we saw at the end of season 2, there was going to be a plot line about the airline tickets, and Livia was a witness to that, and she might have testified against Tony. We really don't know the full direction of how the story would have shaken out, but her death completely changed the trajectory of the show.
Yeah, and then we got Janice back, which is also, very interesting because, thinking about it moving forward, I'm like, Janice is such a critical character. So it's of course tragic that she died. It's just interesting when you think about the whole trajectory of the show and sort of, just these little like dominoes that fall into place that impact certain things taking place and who's going to be in the show, etc.
It's interesting to think about, like, I think the show, if Nancy Marchand hadn't passed away, it would have it would have continued to revolve around the mother-son dynamic. That was really the big plot point of season 1. Season 2, they weren't talking, but it was still about that.
Right, like she was in the background, like still, and then stuff like Janice and also.
Yeah, but she would have been Tony would have been forced to kind of interact with her again this season, and it would have continued to be like a mother-son story. And it's interesting that as the series goes on, it gets further and further from that. Livia, her shadow still hangs over the entire show.
Right, like literally, and then also like metaphorically. But I do like, and I mean, to talk about this another time, but how in season 6, how like Tony says to Carmela, like, my shrink told me that the reason I forgave Junior was because I was trying to prove to my mother that I was a good boy. So I like that they did like bring it back a couple more times, but yeah, it definitely became less, mother focused and more just sort of about, the other characters in Tony's life.
And obviously we don't know how the storyline would have went if she had stayed in there. We know a little bit about how this season would have gone, but further seasons, who knows how it would have gone. But I think in retrospect, the show is able to go into more interesting places when it's not so tied to the mother-son thing. Now, that's not to say that I didn't love Nancy Marchand's performance and love that dynamic, but the show was able to kind of take this tragedy and kind of grow from it in a very interesting way.
Yeah, and I agree that I think it would have been really tough for there to be a situation where Olivia actually did testify against him. I mean, obviously they could have made it work by putting it in like that, but I almost feel like Olivia, growing up in this family and like kind of being in life, like that would just be so like her ratting, like in general, and then like against her own son. Although she did want to kill him, but I almost feel like killing him, like she wanted to get away with like no one knowing about it. But like if she were actually going to testify against him, like she would have to actually do it to his face. You know what I mean? And I feel like that would be a whole different like level of.
Yeah, I feel like they would have like gotten around it somehow. Like they would have had Tony like somehow make up with her and he'd have to deal with that. But again, I think in general, it would have continued to be about the mother-son relationship.
Yeah, definitely.
Versus later seasons kind of do some more different stuff. But this episode, we're introduced to a kind of a recurring element, which is Tony's racism when it comes to who Meadow is seeing and who she's interacting with, particularly this kid Noah. And that's going to be an actually recurring motif throughout this season that's going to kind of drive them apart. And it's interesting, this is the first sort of, like, we haven't gotten any hints that Tony was like this before, but I think when it comes to his daughter, he's more protective than he usually is.
Right, yeah, and I think he was also, like, I think he lets his anxiety from other issues sort of just, like, roll over to other things, so I think it was just sort of like a disaster waiting to happen, but yeah, this was certainly not one of Tony's finer moments, but it also kind of, it ties into the unidentified black male theme. I mean, in this case, Noah's identified, but in terms of that sort of scapegoating, was that unidentified black male throughout the series whenever that comes up.
Yeah, and the show definitely calls Tony out for it. It kind of mocks this idea that he's like kind of putting down black people for being criminals when he himself is a way worse criminal than pretty much any other characters we see on the show. So.
Right. No, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
But I think it also kind of ties into Meadows' like growing independence this season. Like this season in particular, she is as far away from her family as possible. She's in college.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it gets to the point where in the middle of the season, she starts being kind of hostile towards Carmela too. Like I think more, mainly like in Second Opinion, where she sort of was acted nasty to Carmela when she came and visited her at college at her dorm. But yeah, I think this is, where she sort of, she wanted to get away. Although even now, the fact that she's decided to go to Columbia as opposed to what she said she originally wanted to, have the entire North American landmass between her and Tony and Carmela. So I think it's like we can sort of start to see already that she's more of a family oriented than we might have thought from, her previous discussions in the, prior seasons about wanting to get away as far as possible.
Yeah, she definitely comes back. She goes away for a while, then she kind of returns, which we'll talk about.
Yeah, it's like what Melfi says. Yeah, in terms of constant coming and going.
Moving on to Fortunate Son here, this is the one where Christopher finally gets made. But the title, is very ironic in the sense that, yes, he's fortunate that he's risen to this position, but we're going to learn that, like, mafia life is not all that he imagined it would be.
No, not at all. And I think it's really, telling, of course, when the fact that, when he and Eugene are both made at the same time, and the whole "may I burn in hell if I betray my friends." But then at the same time, in Christopher's case, he also then is going to follow his boss into hell. So I guess in either case, you're going to hell, right? Because you're either following Tony into hell or you're going into hell from betraying him.
It's interesting that we're introduced to Eugene this episode. I don't know if this is. I think we saw him before, but he's another character who he's going to kind of be in the background for a lot of the show. But as he goes on, he's going to be kind of important to some themes that are going to emerge, and particularly like season 6.
Oh yeah, definitely. And also one other thing I forgot to add from the prior episode is that that's when we first meet Ralph, which is he's sort of almost like a Richie type in terms of stirring the pot.
Ralph is going to be the first kind of exception that we get to the trope that they were setting up, which is the seasonal villain, in the sense that Ralph doesn't just go away at the end of the season. Like, he actually sticks around for another one.
Right, it's the opposite. He is risen. He rises to captain.
But it's definitely, his story is going to be a very interesting one this season and next season. I think a character like this is one of the reasons why the season is so dark. He's not as aggressive as some of these other guys like Richie or Feech Lamanna, but he's sort of...
It bottles up, and then it, like, when it comes out, it really comes out, like, with...
Yeah, he's almost like psychopathic disregard for people. It's like, it's almost worse than a lot of the other actions we've seen so far.
I always, like, always wanted to make a meme, because how, like, he blames everything on Coke. I almost, like, wanted to make this meme once where it was, like, cocaine, then saying, like, don't blame this on me, like, that's all you psychopath, in terms of him, like, blaming everything he'd done, like it was the Coke. Like, no, I'm pretty sure that was you.
It's interesting with Ralph. We're told, like, the explanation for where he's been is that he's been in Miami this whole time, which is a little weird when you think about it, because we don't ever really see, like, the family having a strong interest down in Miami. We'll have a little bit later in season 6, but it seems weird that this maid guy was down there this whole time. I think they just didn't want to use the prison excuse again, because they just used that with Richie, and they wanted some other reason why this character had to be away all this time before coming back.
Right. Especially since as they later talk about, since he grew up, in the neighborhood. So I guess that would make it easier for him to sort of come back and transition back in. But yeah, it's kind of like they substituted the can for Miami, basically.
But moving on here to Employee of the Month, which is I think the most brutal episode in terms of the show. Like, I don't think anything they showed on the show was worse than this episode. And it was just...
I don't know either. Like, just, between what actually happened and just in terms of, like, the shock value of it. And it was the fact that it happened to Dr. Melfi. It was even more of a violation, because it's like, we're learning in this world, even though it's this, the mafia that sometimes resorts to violence, that there are still these lines and these boundaries that don't get crossed. And then we are just, this sort of swoops in out of nowhere. And even like the rules that we thought we knew, we realized there really are no rules in general.
Yeah, and I think that the ending of this episode is so powerful. I know it bothered so many people, but I really don't understand that. I think her decision and her integrity was so much more powerful than just like the revenge fantasy of having this guy killed. I think it says so much about her character. And it's one of the reasons why I respect her as a character just so much.
Yeah, I think it would be, there'd be more instant gratification or satisfaction from telling him. But then from that point on, yeah, there would be no real like boundary between them in terms of, he would be able to sort of hold that over her head. Like if he did, or, if she did give him, his name, or it just was something where he'd have sort of like bonded her to him inseparably, like how he sort of uses like with Christopher with the whole Barry Haydu in season 4. I feel like that would have been, now they're sort of stuck in something together. And yeah.
I have one criticism of this episode, and I know a lot of people will probably disagree with me. Her rapist's name is Jesus Rossi, which is a reference to Jay Rossi, Janice Rossi from Goodfellas, who Lorraine Bracco's character is like...
Right, the one who harassed, he like harassed her, right?
Yeah, I think that's kind of a cheap joke for a subject matter that's so serious. Like, I get the reference and it's fine, but like, I don't think there should be any joke even close to this.
I get what you mean. Yeah, that's a good point, because it's one thing to sort of like, when they make those little like ridiculous references, like, you know, Long John Silver, maybe in terms of like with the killing of Joey Peeps, like sometimes, you know, the ridiculous, like hilariousness in the face of tragedy is part of what makes the Sopranos great. But yeah, there has to be a line also when it's like, yeah, it shouldn't, from how, with how much they, you know, showed us, it's like, you could wanted this to send the brutal message. So then, yeah, then sort of like comedy doesn't really fit into that.
Yeah, it just kind of, it trivializes it a little bit. But again, it's not a huge deal, and most people probably won't even notice that. But yeah, I just wasn't a big fan of that aspect. But kind of moving on to the next episode here, another Toothpick. We have more like Tony Jr. development in this episode. They kind of have their own...
Oh, right, like moment, yeah, where Junior, when he tells Tony that when he's diagnosed with cancer.
And that cancer storyline is going to be, you know, a plot point that runs throughout this season. We're gonna deal with it in another future episode.
It to me, it's another like one of the many sort of health issues that Junior's gonna encounter and deal with. I feel like in a way it's almost like sort of jinxed himself by trying to get out of jail on medical, and then he then comes down with all these health issues like over the ensuing years. It's almost like he jinxed himself. It's like, okay, you want to get out of medical, and we're going to give you some medical issues to deal with.
It's just another one of the tragedies in his life. You know, we have Artie. Artie has a storyline this episode of like being in love with Adriana, and his relationship with Charmaine is falling apart. You know, that obviously doesn't go anywhere, but you know, it's interesting the kind of struggles that Artie goes through in the show, kind of wanting to be one of these guys, and it's just, it never works out for him.
Yeah, this was like sort of Artie wanted one of his, you know, I'd say, you know, this season and then next season with the whole Jean Philippe thing are, I think, the moments where, you know, Artie's really his weakest in terms of being tempted to sort of get involved in that. But I think even Tony knew that wouldn't have even, like worked out, which I think was why didn't really take it seriously. But then Artie, of course, did. But yeah, I don't know what was... He definitely seemed like he was going through an identity crisis with how sort of reckless he was acting with Charmaine, where he's basically like, okay, whatever, like, it's me, whatever.
And obviously the storyline in this episode with Bobby's father, Bobby Sr., you know, killing Mustang Sally. It was a nice story. It was a interesting storyline to follow his father. He's a character, you know, just for this one.
Yeah, great one episode character for sure.
Yeah. But it kind of relates back to Junior and the whole not going to the funeral. Again, just kind of reinforces just like how selfish these guys are, that like he won't even go to his friend's funeral because he just, you know, he's just not feeling well. He just doesn't want to leave the house.
And then Marie kept asking me what was the cause of death, because he was like so anxious to know about whether he was going to be like the next one cursed. So he was like, did he die from the cancer or was it from the accident? Which was like sort of a hilarious, like absurd moment, which, you know, provided I think some comic relief. But yeah, it goes more to your point about in terms of just thinking of themselves rather than what actually happens.
Definitely a little more of a self-contained episode. But then we lead into University here, which is one of these like defining episodes of the show that just is like, when you think about Sopranos, this is one of the episodes that just immediately pops up.
Definitely. It was, I mean, there's so much, happened obviously with Ralph and Tracy, but also just at home in Tony's home family too, with Meadow, and sort of seeing these contrasts and these different worlds that were like so close yet so far, in terms of just Meadow and Tracy and Meadow and Caitlin and Tracy, and very powerful.
I love the parallels in this episode between Tony and Meadow. So they both have these female figures who are kind of looking to them for support, and they both sort of blow them off. And I think it's interesting that at the height of when Meadow and Tony are hating each other and not getting along, they both are going through this similar journey that's going to bring them back together here. And Tracy's death like deeply affects Tony like subconsciously, to the point where it's going to become a huge thing next season too.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and I love how the different comparisons, even all the way down to like Tracy going to the orthodontist to get her braces, and then Meadow like having to Carmela reminding her to call the dentist and make her dentist appointment. Sort of like those little comparisons and contrasts to like, Tracy's obviously a stripper, bada bing, versus Meadow is losing her virginity, so sort of like losing this innocence, and yet, like you said, also in terms of Tony and Meadow not having a very good relationship at the time. But then at the same time, Tracy tells Tony, "You're the only one I can talk to." So it's sort of these like 180 opposites.
Yeah, it's again one of the most powerful episodes in terms of like the themes that it gets at, the characterization. Leading into the next episode here, Second Opinion. I love the parallels in this episode too. So we have like two really strong storylines going on here. Junior seeking a second opinion about his cancer diagnosis from his doctor, and then Carmela also seeking a second opinion on her marriage through this therapy. It's been interesting that Carmela has actually been going to therapy this whole season. We didn't really mention it a couple episodes ago, but she's been going with Tony for couples counseling, but then she gets recommended to go on her own as well too. But it's funny that those two storylines just kind of really parallel there.
Yeah, and I also thought that when the Junior, when he sought his second opinion from Dr. Maida, and then Dr. Maida, excuse me, and when Dr. Maida then said that they should have a tumor board, and it basically the way that he described like the meeting between the surgeons to discuss what to do, and it made me think of like a sit down in the mafia in terms of a parallel situation where these, all that the head surgeons from the hospitals, they come together and discuss what the best course of action is. And then they relay their answer to you. Like, you're not going to be there. They'll be there and they'll talk about you, and then they'll relay their answer to you.
Dr. Kennedy was, kind of the boss of his own world until Tony and Furio, which is one of the funniest scenes, that golf course scene.
Oh, you got to beat on your that was a classic scene.
Yeah, but they definitely remind him that like there's more dangerous people than doctors out here in this world. But yeah, I love the scene with Melfi and the therapist. I think a lot of people really love how honest that guy is with her, and he's just like, no bullshit aside, like not like Dr. Melfi, like constantly like have the kitty gloves on. He's like, no, this is what you need to do. You need to leave him. You're culpable if you stay. And, she doesn't take that to heart.
How's that going? I love when she's like, my priest said I should work with him. How's that going?
Yeah. And obviously, like, she does the Tony thing, which is she ignores the real issue and it becomes about money, which is at the end of the episode, she forces Tony to donate $50,000 to the school.
The very gangster of her. I mean, she gets a mob boss to kick up to her for the school.
Yeah, and it's it's a dark ending, like all this season. We talked about the kind of the darkness hanging over the whole thing, where she's depressed, she doesn't want to face reality, and so she turns to money instead of facing it.
Well, I think also even Meadow's sort of in denial, like the way that she was like, "Oh, that's so corrupt." I think it was almost her way of projecting what she obviously still is conflicted about with her own family.
Yeah, but obviously at the end of this episode too, I thought that despite how shitty this whole situation is, I thought them going out to dinner, like Tony suggests, was one of those little moments that like you see the chemistry between the two of them. Like, yeah, this is a fucked up ending when you think about it, but there's still this kind of like...
It's still a give and take, and a give and a take, just like what he said, like marriage is or any other partnership's a give and a take, but in a good way. Like I'm saying, that's important for any relationship, for the back and forth balance.
Yeah, no, definitely. Now, the next episode, He Is Risen, the Thanksgiving episode of one of the Thanksgiving episodes of the show. This conflict between Tony and Ralph has been building and building. Like from the very get-go, Tony's really not like this guy, and now it's coming to a head through this very passive-aggressive refusing dinner.
Right, yeah, canceling Thanksgiving, blah blah blah.
But again, it's interesting that again they build up this conflict like you kind of think it's going to go like the way it went with Richie and stuff, but
right, and then they throw you totally a curveball with Gigi. This is one of my I think I love the play on words with the episode title in terms of like, you know, have you heard the good news? He is risen, but then also in terms of thinking about Ralph, like he is risen to captain by the time we get to the end of the episode, and also this is when we meet Gloria, which is, I think
Gloria for me is the most important Gumar that Tony ever had.
Yeah, I would agree. I think she's the one that definitely impacts him emotionally the most. Like, I think he thought of Irina as more of a kid. Like, he felt badly for her. I don't think he really cared about Valentina. I think he was, in terms of, the most emotionally impacted by Gloria.
He only has 3 Gumars over the course of the show. Like, he has obviously other one night stands and stuff like that, but it's honestly, it feels like more women than there actually are. But there are 3 real like women that he's in relationships with, and Gloria is the most important one. We'll talk about, you know, what her storyline means in a few episodes here, but from the very get-go you sense that like, oh, there's gonna be some trouble here. Like, he meets her in therapy. She's obviously got like a darkness about her too, just like he does, and we'll explore what attracted him to her and her to him in a later episode.
Yeah, and I think it's like you could see Melfi's look of concern on her face, almost as like if she knew, like when she heard sort of the voice in the background, and she was like, "Oh shit, what have I done?"
This is also when Jackie Jr. and Meadow officially get together. Like, we were introduced to him last season, where there was even a scene of them talking together. So we kind of thought like, oh, maybe something's going to happen here. But it takes the kind of ending of Meadow and Noah, which we kind of skipped over that last episode. What do you think about the way that they just kind of ended? Like, he just kind of broke up with her out of nowhere like that.
So I think, well, 2 things. I think that, you know, part of it was, you know, he was sort of like an asshole guy, but I think some of it, perhaps a good portion of it, may have been his father. I mean, we see how influential his father was in terms of, you know, with the whole grades and the restraining order with Caitlin. I could definitely see his dad saying to Noah, like, this girl's father is involved in, you know, this, you know, organized crime, because I'm sure Noah told him, if anything, or if he just, you know, sort of knew the name. So I think between that and, you know, to be honest, Noah just, you know, having gotten laid and sort of done what he wanted to do, I think, you know, between that and, but I certainly think I do think his father had some influence in terms of, you know, whether it's because of who her father is or because he's concerned about his grades or both. What do you got? What do you think?
So I agree. I think it really comes down to his father. I think it's kind of it's an interesting parallel that Meadow's father was so against this relationship, and so is his father, but for different reasons.
Right. Yes. Exactly.
I also think though that, like, you know, there's some people who think that maybe Noah slept with Caitlin because there's a scene where she goes up to his room for a while.
I don't think they did. I don't think
so either. I think, like, knowing her, she would have said something. Like, we would have had a scene actually confronting that, especially since we'll see it in Pine Barrens that, like, they're still friends.
She's better. And right, and she seems like she's doing better, like, at that time. So yeah, I think if something weird had happened with Noah, I feel like, yeah, something would have come up eventually. Somehow.
Yeah, no, and they're still obviously friends later on, so I feel like like nothing bad happened between Caitlin and Meadow. But yeah, it is shocking, but I think it's meant to be kind of subversive like that.
Yeah, it's almost like a red herring. Like they throw in like a little sort of something that they want you to think that this might have happened, even though it didn't.
Yeah, but moving into the next episode here, the Telltale Moozadell. You know, we've got an AJ focused storyline. We actually, if I'm remembering correctly, we haven't really had that many AJ focused episodes this season. Like, this is kind of one of the first ones that is going to revolve around him a lot.
Yeah. Other than this one, I'd say Fortunate Son kind of had a couple parallels with him and Christopher, with like the whole trying to make him, you know, the captain, and then him passing out.
AJ's panic attack, yeah, and Fortunate Son, which
but between Fortunate Son and this one, and then it's not really till Army of One where AJ becomes the central focus.
You're right. I forgot about that panic attack that
I
we
almost
learned.
forgot. I forgot about it too before I just thought of AJ again.
Obviously, that plays on to what we learned last season, which is Tony's panic attacks are hereditary. It's this kind of soprano curse that's falling through the whole thing. And obviously, it's going to become a big thing later on in the season. But yeah, AJ, is acting out like he's been doing, trashes the school pool with Lady Gaga, who has a cameo, or not a cameo, but this is before she was famous. But yeah, she's in that scene.
And I love how Carmela's like, "Why did you do it? Were you mad at someone?" As if like there would have been a justification for him to do it in the first place.
No, but it's like Tony does too. Like they're
Yeah,
kind of
right,
screwing
exactly.
around.
It's funny, right? Like it's funny how it comes out, how they say it.
Yeah, but obviously Tony is escalating his relationship with Gloria. We're seeing the first kind of hints that, or not maybe the first hints, but we're seeing more hints that like she's a little unhinged. She says some things that subconsciously remind him of his mother. Like he doesn't even realize it yet, but he's seeing his mother in this woman.
Yeah, and I could even see possibly him seeing even a little bit of Janice, perhaps when she first told him that she practiced Buddhism. I could, because he thinks of Janice and he's like, well, she was supposedly all Zen, but obviously not. So yeah, I think definitely with the "oh poor you," he sees the red flags, but of course his temptation gets the best of him.
It's interesting the show's like how the show treats Buddhism, because
that's what I said. That's what I said to Michael Imperioli actually on I'm sorry, I mean to interrupt. I think it's great that you brought that point up, because I sort of asked Michael Imperioli on the Talking Sopranos. It was like one of my questions I had for him, like, did David Chase have some sort of very like cynical view toward Buddhism almost, because he shows like people that are practicing it but that end up having like these very dysfunctional outcomes even like either way.
What did Michael say?
He didn't really think so, or he didn't, he was a nice about it, but I think it was, he didn't think there was anything specific about from David Chase, but I think perhaps it just more so goes into the whole, I think David Chase obviously had a general cynicism of, society, but I had the same thought as you about the thoughts on Buddhism.
Well, Michael actually wrote this episode, the Telltale Moozadell. I think this is probably the first episode he wrote. Maybe there's I don't know off the top of my head, but
yeah, I think this is the first one he wrote.
And he I don't know if he's Buddhist, but he has some sort of like spirituality.
Yeah, I think he is a Buddhist, and yeah, and he does like meditation class and stuff.
So it's not even on David Chase. Like Michael wrote this about Gloria.
I should go back and be like, so this was you, Michael. Never mind.
Trying to put it all on David Chase.
You should be like, no, it's me. That was me. I take credit for it. That's what you should have said.
Now, we will see more Buddhists later on. We'll talk about that in season 6. But yeah, it's just interesting how, both Gloria and Janice both have that element to them. And for both characters, like, it doesn't really seem to... you're right, they don't like really practice it. It's just something they do, but it doesn't really reflect who they are.
Right. And same with Richie also. I mean, he wasn't necessarily practicing Buddhist, but he was all about like, oh, my yoga, like I learned a lot of meditation in the can. Well, obviously it didn't help your temper, but
yeah, it's just interesting that they have those parallels there. But yeah, obviously AJ's getting into trouble here, which it's funny that the school doesn't really try to punish him, and it's just kind of reinforcing this negative behavior where the AJ just sort of gets away with it without any punishment, very similar to what they did with Meadow in season 2 with the house.
Right, because they're scared of Tony, like, and the thing, and it's funny because in this case, like, Tony wouldn't have even done anything, like he wouldn't have retaliated against the school principal and the coach for punishing AJ. Like, they showed up pretty sure they thought that AJ was going to end up like getting expelled eventually, but then they were so scared of retaliation that they ended up just going easy on him.
And we also have Jackie Jr. trying to basically pretend to be a gangster, trying to, stick up for this guy Matouche. It doesn't end well, and we're going to see how that blows up in his face in a couple episodes here.
Oh my God, Jackie Jr. is so cringe in this episode.
Well, I think we'll talk about that when we deal with this storyline here, because I think there's more to this character than I think people kind of give him credit for. Kind of talking about some of the themes we talked about last episode with Sean and Matt and stuff like that, this kind of destruction of the youth. But we can save that for Army of One. But let's move in here to save us all from Satan's power, the Christmas episode. We got a lot of holiday specials this season.
It's one of my favorite. This is one of my favorite episodes, but that's just a personal thing.
Yeah, we got a lot of flashbacks, which I think is actually very cool because we got to see a little bit more of how this organization worked at a different time. We got Jackie Aprile Sr., we've got Junior, fighting a war over, or not a war, but like fighting a conflict over who's going to be boss. And it's interesting that like Tony's taken the time here to kind of reflect back on his friend, which he hasn't really thought about since, the end of last season.
Right. Like his if anything, his subconscious when it sort of like set it aside because it's just like he didn't have the sort of the capacity to deal with it at that moment. But yeah, I guess now, and especially with the holidays, and of course he's going to start thinking about Santa, and it's sort of, and I think that's for all of us, I think holidays and certain times of the year, it tends to, brings up like, you start thinking of the past because you just think of like previous times during those occasions when you were, someone else was around, etc.
What do you think about this element that they put in this episode where Tony thinks that Pussy flipped back in 1995 when all this stuff's going down with Jackie Sr. and Junior? That really doesn't seem to be the case. Like the FBI agent, when he's talking with Pussy, tells him that like you've been on our tits since 98. But Tony, for some reason, is starting to think that it was way before then. What do you make of that element?
Yeah, so with how sort of he acts in response to, Polly touching the suit. And then when Christopher started chiming in and Polly's like, and Pussy's, pissed off because he wanted to get a word in, I guess it does seem like a situation, when you look at it from then Tony and Syl's perspective of, oh, he must have been wired up. You can kind of be like, oh, okay, that would make sense. But I guess at the same time, he also could have just been in a grumpy mood that day and not wearing a wire, but just kind of having a puss on his face, no pun intended. I think that's one of the things that we never really got like a solid answer to, just in terms of the timeline. Because of the fact that we never really went back to that time period other than that brief moment. So I don't know if the 95 and the 98 was simply like an error or sort of an oversight between seasons, or if it was something where, there's one thing or another, but it would make more sense to me that it would have started in 98 based on the way that Puss confesses in the boat when they're on the boat. Yeah, so I think it's unclear. I guess would be my.
It's also weird in this episode how we get a dream from Silvio.
Yes, and unique because usually we don't get much into like too deep into Sil's mind. He's usually pretty close to the vest with his emotions. So
we get a dream sequence from Silvio, which really never happens before. It's just an odd like plot element to just kind of throw into the episode that just kind of muddies the water about Pussy's storyline. I mean, I think it is kind of a mistake. Like, I don't know quite what they were trying to say. Like, maybe it's just Tony's paranoia and stuff like that, but I really don't think it goes anywhere meaningful.
Right. Yeah. I don't think there's really, a complete resolution. I think overall it's perhaps more just about the fact that he's still sort of processing this, and also his inability to address it with Dr. Melfi, sort of like the fact that they keep, they get to this wall that they can't get past. And this is, something that's clearly like weighing heavily on his mind, but because of what actually happened in terms of them murdering him. I mean, he tells her without telling her, but yeah, I think it's a lot of unfinished, still some, ghosts or proverbial skeletons in Tony's closet.
Obviously, in this episode, they bring up the big mouth Billy Bass again, which reminds Tony of what happened with the dream about Pussy as the fish, and Meadow giving him the toy obviously brings up these memories too. So yeah, they're definitely they're still dealing with the trauma of what happened with Pussy. It's just interesting they bring that up again.
And then we didn't get to see that was the first and last time we got to see really Jackie Aprile Sr. before he was sick, sort of like in action.
Yeah, it's always nice to have him. I mean, he was gone like so quick on the show that it's nice to see him back anytime we can.
I liked seeing him in the Deuce. It was cool to on HBO. I don't know if you've seen it.
I've not seen it, but I've heard Michael Gandolfini's also on that show too. So that's
and also the actor who plays Patrick Parisi.
Oh, okay.
As well.
Yeah, it's cool. I mean, there's a lot of crossover between all these HBO shows. But moving on to the next episode, Pine Barrens. All right, I've given some spicy takes. I'm gonna give another one here, and you can just tell me what you think. I think Pine Barrens is overrated.
No, I agree, and I say that with the utmost love and respect for Pine Barrens, in the sense, of course, that most Sopranos episodes, even if they're not the best, are still better than most of what's out there. But I happen to like To Save Us All from Satan's Power better. I wouldn't put Pine Barrens like in my top 10.
Dude, it was so funny when I did a top 10 episodes video and I didn't put Pine Barrens.
And you got probably hate blasted, hate comments.
People got so mad about that. And I'm like, guys, it's a really good episode. Don't get me wrong. In fact, I actually recommend people, like, if you've never watched the show, I would watch this episode first, because I think it's self-contained enough where you can follow along with it. But it actually, I think, is a stronger episode than the pilot in terms of entertainment. But man, dude, people act like this is like Whitecaps or Made in America or University or something, where it's like, this is not that important of an episode. It's fun. There's some cool stuff that happens in it, but man, do people like to hype this up like it's the greatest thing in television history.
I know, and that's when sometimes I get annoyed. It also it made me think back into the Gumar thing, because if you just sort of look at these like sort of random generic articles that come out about The Sopranos, it'll be like, here's a list of all 12 of Tony's Gumars, or like, this is why Pine Barrens is the greatest episode of television ever. And I'm like, okay, or I don't know if we need to be that overstated, in the words of Sylvia. And I think at the end of the day, it comes down to it's our opinion. To use Eugene Pontecorvo's words, it's an opinion. Some people do get, I think, a little bit too worked up, not just even with Pine Barrens, but in terms of like knowing for sure the ending. Dude, it's not, there's no answer.
Yeah, people like to talk about all the behind the scenes stuff, like Steve Buscemi directing it, Tim Van Patten's dream, the fact that it wasn't shot in Pine Barrens. Like, there's a lot of fun stuff about this episode, don't get me wrong, but I just, like, when you look at the most important, like, character-driven episodes of the show, I don't think Pine Barrens even comes close. It's a great episode, very entertaining, but it's also one that I've watched like 100 times. Like I said, I show people this episode when I'm trying to introduce them to the show, and it's just like, I've seen it enough times where I almost skip it on rewatches. Like, I know that's gonna piss people off, but I'm just like, guys,
as long as you don't just don't tell me you skip the Melfi scenes. That's the only thing I'll judge you for skipping.
No, skipping Melfi scenes are cringe, but
it's blasphemy.
But yeah, nothing more we can say about this episode. It's great. Don't get us wrong, but in terms of like interesting stuff, the only interesting element that I would want to bring up right in this discussion is, I find it interesting that Meadow has her kind of Italian housewife moment here, where she goes to confront Jackie Jr. while she's sick. It reminded me of Lorraine Bracco confronting in Goodfellas.
That's so true. And also sort of, it reminds me a little bit of almost of Tony too, in terms of like sort of the aggressiveness, like going to like take matters into her own hands. But yeah, the sort of the Lorraine Bracco, or like I could see like Gabby Dante doing that sort of thing too. Really, any of the ladies, really. Yeah,
it's just interesting that this is the most she's kind of like a stereotypical mob wife. And when she's confronting Jackie Jr. here, and she'll be involved in mob stuff, but just not in that kind of stereotypical way moving forward. But let's move on to the next one here. Amour Fou, another really, really good episode. We see Gloria and Tony's relationship really, they're having problems. Amour Fou, crazy love.
Amour Fou, and he says, "I didn't just meet you; I've known you my whole fucking life."
Yeah, that's really indicative of who she is. Like, he's seeing his mother, like, even though his mother died this season, like, her ghost still remains in the form of this almost psychopathic woman.
Mm-hmm. And it's sad because it's like, I feel like there are so many sort of signs of that things are going to go really poorly with Gloria, not just in terms of with Tony, but in terms of her life. Like when she makes those comments about, my sister doesn't let me, talk to my niece and nephew, maybe I'll just get hit by a bus. Like sort of these comments that in hindsight, you're like, damn, it really does sort of sound like someone who could be at risk for, having sort of suicidal thoughts or.
And Carmela's got her own storyline this episode. She is dealing with all these emotions. She fears that, she's got cancer, or she fears that she's pregnant, which usually pregnancy is a sign of happiness, but just where she and Tony are in their relationship right now, it's like, it almost fills her with more dread.
Yeah, and I think it's like, it's almost her mental, that's her way, almost like how Christopher said, like, maybe I have cancer, when he didn't know how to like identify that he was depressed. I feel like Carmela is almost all of her sort of issues and emotions about Tony and her family and her kids and everything is sort of like manifesting in these physical health symptoms that she's having.
Yeah, I think that whole cancer thing is a recurring element for a lot of these characters. It kind of represents darkness kind of gnawing at them from the inside.
Right, and death that you can't like avoid. Like it doesn't matter, you could be the boss of a mob family, like it comes for you.
And of course, this episode we have Jackie Jr.'s failed robbery of the card game. We'll talk about Jackie Jr.'s storyline in the next one, but it's interesting that he has a moment sort of like Christopher has in
46 Long with the
where he almost stops doing, he realizes how stupid this is, that he almost has a moment of clarity, but then he goes through with it anyway.
Right, peer pressure, almost like I feel like they sort of like at that point he was just like, yeah, let's do it before the crank wears off.
Definitely. Well, let's move on to Army of One here, because this is one of the great finales for me. Like as great as the previous two finales were, this one is the best so far for me in the sense that it's so powerful. Jackie Jr.'s killed and they're dealing with the aftermath of that.
Also, Michael K. Williams, one episode character, that was a great appearance.
This was right when they started, I think season 1 of The Wire had come out. So people, he was immediately recognized as the star that he is. We lost him way too quickly, but
I know, he was so phenomenal in Boardwalk Empire as well.
But it was awesome that we got to see him on this show. But, Jackie Jr., like I was saying beforehand, a lot of people like tend to write him off as like, oh, he's so stupid. Like he's the dumbest character of all time. And while that's true, I think there's this element that the older generations are kind of preying on the younger ones. We like Christopher's storyline is so much about this, right? Where he feels sort of like picked on by the older generations. And we see, as dumb as the younger generations are on this show, there's an element that like Tony and Ralphie almost preyed upon this kid. They like destroyed him for their own kind of needs.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I think that Ralph, be more at fault in terms of being like a poor influence. But I think it's telling when they have that moment at the end where Jackie is about to walk out and then gets shot, where he and Lena have this little like cute moment of where it's like he's like, why are you laughing? But it's like almost like a heartfelt moment where you see this like sort of, or I see this like little this tenderness in Jackie where you almost feel almost a little badly for him, even if I thought like he was doing stupid dumb stuff the whole time, I was almost like, this is the end of the day, this is just really like barely a man. He's barely out of high school. Like he's a kid still.
Yeah, he was just led down the wrong path, just like we're going to see with Christopher. Now, Christopher is not as stupid as Jackie. Obviously, he's more competent, but it's the same thing where it's like the older brothers, the older generation did not look out for him and kind of led him down this wrong path. Now, he's obviously responsible for his own actions too, but yeah, I think it like that chess scene between him and the little girl, where it's like you should have played that out. You're never going to learn unless you try.
Right, sort of like he's trying to skip the steps, sort of like what Christopher did, where he wanted to just, be made right when the Triborough Tower situation, like, and it's not all it's cracked up to be.
And, the ending with Jackie's funeral, one, it shows that, like, as much as these guys talk about how they're family, like, this was Tony's best friend's son.
I know. And it was an insult that the place was, like, empty.
Yeah, no one cared about it. And it's indicative of what's going to happen to Tony, at the end of the series. Like, as much as these guys love him or whatever, once you're gone, and people move on. And I think the hypocrisy that Meadows sees in her family, like, it's almost like they're at this funeral just to have fun with each other, rather than, like, they don't give a shit about Jackie's death at all.
Right. Like, even with Janice, like, she was already, like, making her way into, like, with Ralph. And I think it's so interesting that well, and also just when Junior sings Corn Grotto, I thought that was a very powerful moment. But I think also when Meadow runs out of the restaurant and says it's such bullshit and runs across the street, it reminds me of later on in the series finale, like the actual scene of her running across the street. I know it's not the same street, but visually it reminds me of that. So that's just sort of a side note.
And again, we talked about how this season was all about her getting away from her family, and it ends with her running away to where she's going. We don't know. And obviously we're going to find out next season that she doesn't actually leave, but it's almost like this was one of her opportunities to run away from her family completely. Like, they have no idea where she is or where she's going.
And then she comes back. Yeah, that's a great point also. Like, it could have been technically like Meadows' exit from the show. Like, they could have been like, oh, she decided to go to California to go to, like, finish college, for all we knew.
But we're also, though, seeing her loyalty here, which is, as much as she's hating her family right now and all the bad stuff they've done.
It's like, you don't talk shit about my family, though.
When she's talking with the other girl, yeah, she's like, I can't believe you would share this with an outsider, which I thought was a little weird because that girl... It was
very telling.
Well, no, that girl is Kelly's cousin, so she's actually a member of the April extended family. So I thought that was a little weird, but...
Right, well, and I thought it was, like, more telling with the way that she worded it in terms, because, like, if you weren't in the mafia or you weren't involved in organized crime, I feel like the fact that you wouldn't feel the need to, like, be like, oh, that's an outsider, because it's like, what do you mean they're an outsider from what? Like, you're saying that this isn't the mafia.
Obviously, I mean, she is, like, yeah, talking about the mafia element, but it's weird that, like, if it was Kelly's friend, I would say that, like, okay, yeah, that's an outsider, but it's her cousin.
Yeah, she was at the funeral too, so
it's her cousin, so it's like you are family. This isn't an outsider, but I think it would have been better if it was a friend or something. But that's one slight criticism.
But yeah, but it showed, like, Meadows just really sort of this constant back and forth, like, even within the same conversation, like what we'll see in season 4 with, like, Dr. Wendy Kobler, how she basically, like, tells her her dad's in the mafia, and then in the same conversation is like, there's no such thing as the mafia. I think it's just a lot of back and forth.
Yeah, but obviously, like, a very powerful ending here kind of puts the hypocrisy of this whole life on display here. And you're right, that ending where she runs away, they obviously play on that in the finale with her running across the street again. Like, they're calling back to this moment here.
Right. And it's interesting because in that case, she's running into them or running into the, to restaurant of season, whereas, this time around it's running out.
But an incredible finale overall to, like I said, in my opinion, the darkest season of the show. I know we kind of rushed through a lot of these because last time we went too long, but were there any other thoughts about the season that you wanted that we didn't get a chance to talk about?
Nothing that I can think of right now. Just, yeah, that final scene in Army of One where Junior's saying that was definitely very powerful, was sort of with everyone tearing up. It was almost like they stopped being obnoxious for a couple moments and then sort of got in, like, serious reflecting mode. So I felt like it was almost sort of like their last time where they were all together, where there wasn't really any drama. Because then we see starting in season 4 with Johnny Sack, with all the, Ralph stuff. So it was like, I feel like, yeah, it was marking the end of another period.
Well, that's a perfect place to leave it then. Thank you guys for listening to this episode, and stay tuned for the next one where we're going to talk about season 4. So we'll talk to you guys then.